for those who can't be with us. So if you stay in the call, you would signal us that you're fine with that. Now it's just 9 weeks ago that this war started, and 1 week after the start, we had a first webinar. At that time, there was much uncertainty in the room. How long will that stay with us? How severe will the problems be? And I remember, Tatjana, you've been in that webinar at that time already, and you prepared us. This will be a structural change that we will see. No matter what the conflict in detail will look like, it will be something that will somehow have an impression on this year's energy market development and further on. Now we're, in fact, 9 weeks later or 8 weeks later. Fatih Birol from the IEA called it the biggest supply shock ever, energy-wise, bigger than the two energy shocks of the 1970s in terms of oil supply. So the whole thing escalated, and in this phase, we're somewhere in the midst of getting a bit better feeling. How long will it stay with us? Is the appeasement negotiation attempt, is that successful? And even if so, what will happen in the weeks and months after? How long will the markets will take their time to get back somehow in order and into some sort of equilibrium? Many questions out there, and I'm very glad to have again 4 experts with us with very different perspectives, adding up to make a very complete picture to this difficult question. The 4 are Professor Andreas Goltow. He's the director of the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, and Franz Haniel, professor of public policy at the faculty of the University of Erfurt. Then we have Toril Bosoni with us. Toril is the head of the Oil Industry and Markets Division at the International Energy Agency, somewhere in the heart of this all this trouble, so to say. And then I'm very glad that Dr. Tatjana Mitrova is again with us. Tatjana is not only a research fellow from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, but also, I think, lecturer in many universities, whether it is in Paris, in Oxford, and also know from her time in Moscow as the former director of the Energy Institute there. And then finally, Felix Hüfner. He is the senior European economist, a chief German economist of UBS, the bank Europe SE, and will add the more macroeconomic perspective, I would expect. So energy expertise, political expertise, and the macroeconomic expertise is all with us. Now we'll double check whether Andreas is already back.
I'm here, all good.
Oh, great. That happened, that worked out. So Andreas, I just introduced you and would like to hand it over to you to get us a bit into the phase where we stand at the moment. I mean, we read in newspapers about the political attempts to get closer, but somehow it seemed that the position of the Iran is stronger than ever. And I remember Guido Steinberg on the weekend saying he can't imagine of a quick solution, a quick fix policy-wise. What's your worldview on the macro policy state at the moment of this conflict? Are we close to any sort of solution?
Well, thank you, Carsten. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. No, we're not. And I mean, I got 5 minutes to explain where we are and where we might be going. So I try and cut this short. I guess the first thing to say is it's an absolute stalemate, and it's visible in what we've learned, from the headlines. Does Vance fly to Islamabad or does he not? Are we talking about 10 points on the agenda? Are we talking 11? Are we really talking about the same agenda at all? When it comes to the peace talks, these are questions that are absolutely unclear. For now, talks are off. The situation lingers on. We get quite negative statements coming out of the White House at the moment when it comes to demands and asks from Iran. So that doesn't reassure anyone at the moment. On the Iranian side, having invested in proxy militias all of the entire region for years and years and years to project power, Iran has just found a much better tool, a much easier tool, much easier to wield to project power, and that's the Strait of Hormuz. As we know, so the strait has emerged the sticking point in the talks. Both sides, the US and Iran, threaten to open and close it as they want. On the US side, they have really backed themselves into a corner, the situation that is really hard to leave. They run out of time because very soon the entire US will go into election mode for the midterms. And the last thing you want is some foreign policy adventure dominating the elections or high gas prices or both. Plus, we have an asymmetric situation here in which the US must win, but Iran can afford not to lose. And that's a very different place to be in for both sides. Now, when it comes to the talks themselves, I mean, peace talks, we know that. We know that from so many other incidents. They're the stuff of expertise and experienced diplomats. You need adults in the room for that. And the problem here is that the US team, quite frankly, and I don't want to sound condescending, but they're not very professional. You have a relatively unexperienced, ideologically firm, but unexperienced vice president. You have a son-in-law, and you have a real estate developer with ties to Russia. I mean, this is the negotiation team, and plus, whatever they end up talking, if they end up talking and negotiating, a tweet out of the White House can change everything in 1 minute. So that isn't reassuring a situation, and markets reflect that. $105 per barrel today, 45 euros a megawatt hour for gas this morning. And just a reminder, pre-crisis, that was $72 per barrel and 32 euros a megawatt hour. And that was in the midst of a cold winter and with empty storage. So things don't look good. Where do we go? That's a quick outlook. 3 scenarios that I want to share. I exclude Iranian surrender. That's not an option for Iran. And I exclude US boots on the ground because of midterms coming close, and that doesn't bode well with voters. So there are 3, I think, plausible, not probable, but at least plausible scenarios at the moment. And none of them is good. I think the first one is essentially Trump does what he always does. He declares something. So he declares victory. The US leaves the strait, and that means safe passage is not secured. Someone will come happy to help. That's the Europeans and some like-minded countries. They will sort out the mess with boats, clear mines, all the rest of it. Regional insecurity prevails with renewed attention to defense around the Gulf, and that means the supply problem continues, and it only eases and levels out over time, but very, very slowly. Now, the opposite of this, that's the second scenario, is protracted conflict. So essentially the situation that we have right now, the strait opens, it closes, lots of impact on transit and regional stability, and on top, capacity might be restrained because of the investment not coming in that's needed to repair Ras Laffan and other places that have been damaged, which means the supply problem continues on global oil and gas markets. And then you have somewhat of a halfway house, if you will, and that ceasefire, which you can have. It is meant to be temporary until some permanent arrangement is reached, but it's not inconceivable that this becomes and starts becoming the new norm over time. It probably involves some arrangement of charging a toll by Iran, which is tacitly accepted by the US to keep the situation stable. And that also means that the Gulf does not return to global energy markets as a powerhouse as it has been before, and that will have lasting impacts on exports. A final sentence, because I'm over time already. I think the one thing that worries me, in addition to many things that worry me, but the one thing that worries me really from the European side is I think Europe is still underestimating and underpricing the risk of a prolonged closure of the strait and conflict of the strait. Especially gas prices have been kept relatively low by demand destruction in Asia at the moment. So even prices a little north of 40 euros a megawatt hour do not reflect the possible implications of sustained conflict on gas markets. But I know Tatjana and Toril will talk about this in a much more detail. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this overview. Just one sentence from you on one country that you did not mention. You mentioned the US, Iran, Europe. You did not mention China and maybe China's role in overcoming the conflict. Is that part of that game, or do you see them somewhere viewing at the conflict from the distance?
I mean, Iran, I think, does what a smart man does or smart woman does. You don't stop your adversary from making mistakes. So they sit watching. I think that's what they're doing. They obviously do feel the pain. There is impacts on Asia. You do see the effect of supply problems, particularly in gas. But the longer the US get themselves into the mud, if you will, the better for China. At the moment, I think that's the calculation. Obviously, I'm not in Beijing. That's the one thing I read into the situation, but there hasn't been a lot of signals coming out of Beijing at the moment to get active, to get involved. They're very much at the sidelines and watching the US getting really, really into the mud.
Thank you very much, and I think we'll come back to the bigger picture in the end. Now let's turn to Toril Bosoni from the IEA. Toril, I think you prepared also some figures for us, some slides, and you guide us, I guess, not only through the price risks, but now really to the supply risks, also product-wise that we are facing in aviation, in other markets. So let's give us an overview. How severe is the crisis, and how could it develop in the next weeks to come?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to see, are you seeing my you're seeing my slides?
Oh yes,
okay.
That works well. Thank you.
Okay. No, thanks first of all for having me. I mean, this is obviously something you said we're in the midst of the crisis. I feel that we're not in the midst of the crisis. We're sitting on the sidelines, obviously, but we do follow what's going on in the region very, very closely. But the one thing, so talking about, we hear about crude prices, and when we hear about crude prices, we very often talk about the futures prices. But what we are seeing is that the segments, the art market now is really pricing in scarcity, and you see it in different markets at different times as the flows and the disruptions of flow really hit the market. And as we're going to also talk about the product markets here, I picked jet fuel and diesel in Europe. You obviously see much bigger price increases that we're seeing for the benchmark crude. But also this is something that we're also seeing in Singapore, where product prices have really also seen significant increases, not just because of the loss of crude supplies, but also refined products from the Middle East. So just stepping back a bit and see what the disruption looks like now in terms of what's reaching markets outside of the Middle East. Before in February, about 24 million barrels a day of oil was exported from the Gulf producers. And now in recent days, we see that that's down to about 10 million barrels a day. We had seen slightly higher volumes towards the end of March and early April, but since the US blockade on ships that are affecting Iranian exports through the regions, we've really seen that the flows through the strait are now in the past week below 1 million barrels a day. Of course, the bypass, the volumes coming out of the west coast of Saudi Arabia and Fujairah have increased, but it's significant supply losses. And with countries in the region running out of domestic storage or export options, we now estimate that about 14 million barrels a day of production has already been curtailed. And this could increase in coming weeks if Iran is also forced to shut in production if they run out of storage or storage options for their barrels. So, of course, on the market at the IEA, we published a monthly oil market report, and we published one only a few weeks ago, and we already cut our expected demand forecast for the year from about 800,000 barrels a day expected before the war to about minus 100,000 barrels a day. But this, just to reiterate, this is a very optimistic scenario that we're assuming that there would be a resolution or some agreement reached, and that flows could gradually resume from May. And that's looking increasingly unlikely as the days goes by and negotiations are sort of at an impasse. But what we are seeing is that demand has already been curtailed. In the first instant here, it's concentrated in the second quarter of the year, March, April, about 4 million barrels a day of demand declines, with the biggest impact on aviation because of the disruptions to air travel and petrochemical sectors. So the Middle East was exporting about 1.5 million barrels a day of LPG and naphtha to global markets. And of course, those both petrochemical producers in the Middle East and those that were relying on the feedstocks in Asia primarily have seen their activity being curtailed. We do see demand declines also in OECD and advanced economies. Here, it's more on the fuel price, on the fuel side, as the impact of higher prices is starting to feed through. So I put on a slide here about jet fuel. There has been a lot of concerns about jet fuel, and the jet fuel market is already feeling strained from the disruptions. Jet fuel prices are the ones that have increased the most. And of course, the Middle East refineries, they exported about 400,000 barrels a day of jet kerosene before the crisis. And that sounds like a rather marginal volumes compared to the 15 millions that we're losing in total. But the 400,000 barrels a day represent about 20% of global trade. And for Europe, for instance, Middle Eastern refiners were accounting for 75% of the imports that the Europeans needed to meet the demand in the regions. So obviously, when we're looking at scenarios, of course, we get a lot of questions on how Europe will fare going through the crisis, and if the crisis is prolonged. Of course, now Europe is competing with other importers of jet fuel from alternative suppliers, first and foremost the United States, but we're also seeing increased exports from Nigeria and other countries, South Korea. So if we're seeing that Europe is able to replace about half of the imports that they previously were getting from the Middle East, we could see that the inventory cover in some countries, not all countries, are in the same situation. Obviously, we can see that some airports and countries might run into supply shortages in the weeks to come. So just to finish up, we have, of course, the outlook for the oil market. We heard in the introduction that in the immediate aftermath or the outbreak of the war, there was a lot of uncertainty. In our view, there's still a lot of uncertainty on how events will develop. In our base case, as I said, we see the supply shortfalls concentrated in the second quarter of the year, and then the market could, if flows resume from May onwards, we could see the global market flip back into surplus in the second half of the year. But of course, the longer we stay in this situation, the less likely that scenario is looking. We also presented in a protracted case, if we in a situation when the disruptions are extended into the third quarter and towards the end of the year. This is consistent with the IMF's protracted case scenarios that they publish with GDP forecast in their April report. But even here, you're seeing taking those GDP assumptions provided by the IMF and the prices assumed with that, we do get significant demand destructions, but not enough to balance the market. So you would require an additional 5 million barrels a day of demand destructions to be able, if supplies really are disrupted at the levels that this scenario implies. So I said to finish up, I do have one or two more slides. So here's where we come into, of course, the IEA coordinated with its member countries the biggest ever collective action, release of emergency stocks in the start of March, about 400 million barrels of emergency stocks, split by public stocks and industry stocks. And we are seeing, of course, the lowering of obligations on industry makes that those volumes available to the market immediately and providing flexibility. But now we're also seeing that the public stocks are starting to hit the market. Japan has already released significant portions of their crude oil stocks to be able to maintain refinery operation. We're also seeing the pace of releases from US picking up, and we're expecting to see that the European countries will also increase their stock releasing in the coming weeks and months as the disruptions are really hitting those countries. So with that, I will end here, and I'm happy to take any question, of course.
Thank you very much to you. And in fact, maybe just two brief questions that you may immediately answer. One on the destruction on the refinery side. What we can read is that most of the refineries in the region have some sort of damage already. And can you foresee how long it will take to bring them back to the market? How severe are the disruptions, and how long the repair work will take? And the second one on the kerosene and jet fuel issue, which is probably the one that makes many people nervous, not only in Germany, but all over Europe. What we learned is that the transparency about the stocks of kerosene or jet fuel all over the world is very different. Are there some regions you would want to go to, or is there different developments that you can see in different regions that we should be aware of? We know, I think, the situation in Germany, but not that much in other parts of the world.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. The question about the pace of recovery, the speed of recovery, and the actual extent of the damages is one that we are thinking about a lot. And we have a number of calls, not just for refineries, but also for gas processing, gas liquids, petrochemicals, and also on the upstream. I didn't show the production outlook that we have here, but even in the event of our quick recovery, we do not expect the recovery in production to be as swift. It will take time to bring the oil fields back online to full capacity. Some of the production may not be able to come back the longer fields are shut in, and depending on their reservoir pressures and getting people back, we do think that now even in some countries, especially Iraq, but also Kuwait, that have some challenges to bring production back, it could take time. Saudi Arabia, the UAE might be in a better position. In terms of refineries, we see now, of course, it's very, very difficult to get the information. We read the news, we hear, but of course, this state of affairs is very sensitive, commercially sensitive to the companies, and also in terms of the country's position, they're keeping this information very, very close to heart. So we are spending our time talking to people and looking at satellite images and trying to assess the damage to the different plants. We do think even in our base case, we have held Middle Eastern refinery operations at -1 million barrels a day through until the end of the year. We think that, of course, we cannot know the extent of the damage and how long it will take to repair, but in Bahrain, the Sitra refinery is quite damage. We're also seeing in Saudi Arabia, there are, some countries will maybe be able to repair things faster than others, but we do think we can talk significant amount of time to bring them back. And there will be competition between the different companies and the different operators to conduct the repairs, because they will all be competing for the different parts, different equipment, the same people. So there will be, not everything will come back at the same time. But this is something that, I had 2 calls this morning talking to people, trying to get better information on the extent of the damage and what kind of recovery timelines we're looking at. But the first and foremost is to have the security situation in place that allows the people to come back, because a lot of the workers have left the region, and you would even to get supplies in through the strait. We talked to somebody today who was working in other parts of the world, and they say, well, some of their equipment and units are stuck within the Gulf and cannot leave. So this, the disruption to the strait will not even only have an impact on refinery and industrial complexes in the region, but also in other countries, as they're not able to get those units out of the Gulf. So to be followed, but it's of course, here I will throw it back at the industry representatives who may have this information. But this is, it's a bit challenging to get a full view at the moment. But we do think it would take longer than many people are expecting.
Well, thank you very much. And building on what Toril said, Tatjana, we all don't know how long the Strait of Hormuz will stay blocked. I think there are bets in the UK, professional bets. They can see like 80% probability it will open in May or maybe even earlier. But no matter what, the conflict will stay with us for a while, even if the strait will open. That's what you make clear at the very beginning, looking at product markets and value chains. What's your perspective for the next month or for the remaining year? How fast will we find some sort of equilibrium, some sort of new normal after the crisis of the immediate war has come to an end?
Well, thank you. Just recently I've introduced a new definition. It's no longer Strait of Hormuz, it's Schrödinger Strait. Because basically we don't know when it is open. Trump can declare, or Iranians can declare opening, but basically it's up to the shippers, to the insurers, and to the other market actors to decide whether they feel secure enough for the passage of their ships. So given also all the constraints on the upstream and midstream side, which Toril mentioned, actually, even if there is a deal tomorrow, it will take quite some time, several months at least, before traffic through Hormuz will normalize. And we have to keep it in mind. And it has very significant implications for the European gas market. Well, Toril talked about oil. I will say a couple of words about gas because, Andreas at the very beginning mentioned that European gas prices seem to be inadequately low given the scale of damage and destruction. And I think I have an explanation for that. It really looks a bit counterintuitive. Their prices are still much lower than they were in 2022 after all this disruption created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But basically, right now, Europe is dealing with a gas market under stress, but not with a physical breakdown. So, of course, on the supply side, the destruction, Qatar has lost 17% of its export capacity due to these attacks on Ras Laffan. And with all the shut-ins, each month it's losing significant volumes. Qatar was supplying 20% of the global LNG, but most of this LNG was going to Asia. So actually, European purchases of Qatari LNG were quite limited. We can talk about like 5 to 7 million tons per annum. That's not a lot. And before the Iranian war, significant volumes were actually resold to Asia. So Europe was not of taking its complete contractual obligations. But once these volumes disappeared from market, and they disappeared not in March but in April. Yeah, in March, the LNG tankers which departed from Qatar were still arriving to Europe. Yeah, so only in April, Europe started to lose the physical volumes of Qatari LNG, but basically, European companies managed so far to replace them with the higher pipeline supplies, partially from Turk Stream. Yeah, it is like 1 BCM of Russian gas, partially with the purchases of other spot LNG sources. Just recently, the US LNG Golden Pass just has started and sent the first cargoes on April 22nd. So there is so far Europe is managing to compensate for this disruption, but it is just the matter of a month or two when the European consumers will really face like physical shortage, because it's becoming more and more difficult to find the replacement for Qatari gas. Asian consumers are already going into quite severe demand disruption situation. In many countries, especially the poorest, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, they are just switching to coal, yeah, shutting down all the LNG and gas-fired capacities. In the others, they are competing with the Europeans for each and every spot LNG cargo available. So actually, it will be extremely difficult to secure additional supplies during this summer. And there is, by the way, there is a very interesting trend related to China. Karsten, you've asked about the role of China, not on the political side, but on the commercial. Similarly to the situation back in 2022, when there was very weak Chinese LNG demand, and Chinese companies were basically reselling its LNG to Europe. Right now, the same is taking place. It's driven by the commercial reasons, because Europe is ready to pay higher prices. But this buffer, these LNG resales from China, it's not guaranteed. So at a certain point, Chinese authorities may decide that it's time to limit those resales, and that could put additional pressure on Europe. So the final thing I wanted to make clear, we are not yet in the gas crisis in Europe, and that's the reason for high but still acceptable prices, more or less. Yeah, but European continent needs to refill storages for the coming winter. And we've ended this winter with the lowest level for many, many years. And now purchasing volumes for the next winter is becoming extremely challenging and problematic. The problem is related to a very simple fact. There are no spare LNG or pipeline gas supplies which Europe could attract. You could think about the US LNG. Yes, there are several projects coming on stream this year, just 3. and just few trains, and part of them is already committed. So Europeans will have to compete very severely with the Asian consumers in order to obtain these volumes, and that's not much, and it's definitely not sufficient to cover the gap. There is also an opportunity to slightly increase pipeline supplies from Algeria, maybe 10%, but it's just a couple of BCM. It doesn't change the picture. Well, Azerbaijani gas through the southern corridor, again, they promised to expand the volumes this year by 1.2 BCM for the whole year. It's basically nothing. Yeah, maybe a little bit of additional supplies from Norway. Maybe right now there is higher than usual volumes flowing from Russia via Turk Stream. But Europe is preparing to phase out Russian gas completely. So it's very tricky and very sensitive issue. So, and basically wider Africa, Morocco, Nigeria, and other producers, they don't have LNG available. So there is no source to replace this gas quickly. So there is plenty of gas globally, but it all requires upfront upstream investments, and these investments might become visible only in several years. Even the US LNG, which is preparing, like building up capacity, but again, they cannot speed up further. There will be more gas available in 2027 and especially in 2028, but we need it now for the coming winter. Yeah. So there is a growing discussion about Russian gas. I know this is the question I'm addressed very frequently. Frankly, I do not see any opportunity to increase significantly pipeline gas flows. I've mentioned Turk Stream. That's the only route where tiny increases are physically possible. Everything else is a very sophisticated legal and political story, or with Nord Stream, it's just a technical issue, which again requires years to be solved. So I don't think that it can work in a short term. Russian LNG, this is something that Europe is off-taking quite intensively during the past few months. That could help if it stays in the balance. So if it's not phased out faster than expected. But again, there is a very clear and sensitive political issue associated with this. So summing up, Europe will need each and every molecule available from each and every source, and there is no simple solution. There is no, low-hanging fruit that could solve this puzzle. And I'm afraid, frankly, that another round of demand destruction, especially industrial demand, unfortunately for this year, for 2026, is inevitable, even if Hormuz is finally somehow opened, the situation, this conflict is somehow resolved. Still, unfortunately, industries in Europe have to prepare to a very difficult summer, autumn, and even more difficult winter. I'm sorry to give such a gloomy outlook, adding on top of the pessimistic picture that Toril has drawn, but we have to prepare for this reality, not to be taken by surprise.
Well, thank you very much, Tatiana. And in fact, this is quite a dramatic analysis that both of you have given in terms of oil and gas markets. And in fact, I think the gas market situation is not that much in our minds. What you've described, even if European gas storage is, I think, filled by roughly 30% now, it might get close to get these storage facilities filled before winter comes. And if I understood you correctly, you see that this outcompeting Europe and US and the higher income states outcompeting the Pakistans and the other countries that are not the same ability to pay will not be enough, that there might be risks for even shortages, supply disruptions also for Europe. That's what you're saying, right?
Yes, exactly. And so if the constraints on the supply side remain just for a couple of months, then it's not really dramatic. But if it stays for longer, if it goes into autumn and winter, then unfortunately, I'm afraid there will be another round of demand destruction in Europe as well.
Well, and all of that adds up to the pressure to find whatsoever solution. So the price will be high, I think, for the negotiators. Um, with this, I give it to Felix Hüfner. Now, with the announced macroeconomic view, which might be probably as well quite gloomy with all the analysis that we have heard from the energy side in terms of economic growth, in terms of inflation. What is it what you expect for the whole year with the knowledge that we have today, and what are the scenarios that you have maybe done yourselves?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. So I would address 3 points. One is the growth impact, then what's the sector distribution, and what's the impact then on inflation and interest rates. And if I start with the first one, as economists, we are normally quite used to working with oil price shocks. So we have these sensitivities. 10% higher oil prices normally costs us around 10 to 20 basis points of growth. But the problem is the longer the oil shock lasts, the more nonlinear it gets. So the effects then become larger over time. That is because you may run into supply shocks, supply effects that the previous speakers mentioned, or some other things happen that just get worse when the shock is longer. So what we do then at the global level is to work with scenarios. We have published, for example, a global growth note where we said, if the disruption remains limited to 2 months, then the hit to global growth would be about 0.5%. But if the shock takes much longer, then global growth would be around 1.5 percentage points lower. So it's really crucial how long this shock lasts and how high prices will rise. For now, also relating to the prior discussion, we treat this purely as a price shock. So meaning that we have to pay higher prices, but that we will not feel shortages of energy, which of course would be a risk. But for now, if we don't get into the shortage situation, this would be a big difference to 22, 23, when in terms of our GDP impact, of course, the high prices came along with these fears of gas shortages, and there were massive savings in industry, and that added to the growth impact. Lastly, now before I get to our forecast, so in our forecast we assume that this shock does not persist beyond June 2026. So that's somehow the cutoff, end of Q2, and then prices coming down gradually towards year end. And the severe scenario would be one where just prices remain very high. We simulated a scenario with oil prices persistently at 150. That would basically, in our view, would be the scenario where we clearly would get into recession in the US, but also in Europe. But if we stick to that scenario where the shock remains limited until the end of Q2, we have cut our European forecasts by around 0.5 percentage point for this year. We're now for the Eurozone at 0.8. And it's important, I think, to distinguish between countries within Europe. We think among the large countries, Germany and Italy will be hit a lot harder than France and Spain. That's a function of their higher industry share in GDP, but also more energy dependency. And just to pick out Germany, here we cut our GDP forecast in half. We went from 1.2 to 0.6%. Now, if we look at the data that has come in so far, we have business confidence surveys. We have those for March and April. Not surprisingly, they went down. What was interesting is if you compare what happened in March and April, to March and April in 2022, so right after the Ukraine war started, then the decline in confidence now is about half as much as then. So I think that could indicate that on a company level, so the people that fill in these business confidence surveys, they feel this is different from 22, 23. So it's bad, but it's not as bad as it was back then at this stage. Last thing to say on the GDP outlook, we think we are entering this crisis in a relatively positive position. So it could be worse. One factor is that labor markets are robust. We have unemployment in the Eurozone at record lows. Also, consumers before the crisis happened were starting to spend more, which is very important for growth. And then finally, we have large fiscal support. So we have, in particular, the German package for infrastructure and defense spending, which we think will add about 30 basis points to growth in Europe this year and 60 basis points to German growth, meaning that without this fiscal package, German growth, in our view, would be zero this year. Very lastly, there is a lot of fiscal responses now happening to the shock, fuel tax cuts, and so on. When we look across countries, this is still fairly minor. In terms of costs, it's about 0.1% of GDP in the Eurozone, compares to 2% of GDP in 22-23. Of course, as the shock gets more severe, these costs may also rise. But at this stage, it's relatively minor what countries are doing in addition to the fiscal packages on defense and infrastructure. Second point, you asked me to comment on the sector impact. And I think this is quite wide-ranging. And the business confidence surveys we got so far give us some insight here. The first and easiest is, of course, energy-intensive production is most hit here. That's the chemical sector, that's the steel sector, for example. Overall, we find, however, that the manufacturing sector gives a mixed picture. There were some reports of stronger order flows over the past couple of months, and that seems to be because of the fear of supply disruptions coming. So companies filling up their storages, not really a positive sign, but in the near term, at least, it helps a bit with activity. However, there were also a lot of manufacturing firms that already report supply disruptions. And that's obviously a bad sign because that reminds us of COVID and the 2022-23 shock, that if things evolve more in that direction, that's bad for growth. What is quite interesting and standing out is that the services sector seems to be quite hard hit. Why is that? It seems to be the transport, logistics, tourism sectors. So those that are linked basically to the supply disruptions that manufacturing is talking about. The retail sector has lower confidence because they're fearing higher inflation and less consumption. And then finally, what we also saw in the service is that construction was impacted. That's a bit less intuitive at the beginning. But what seems to be behind that is the fear of interest rate hikes weighing on construction. So if you take everything together, it's pretty widespread how this shock is impacting sectors. There are probably two sectors which are relatively immune. One is everything that is linked to this fiscal spending on infrastructure and defense. And then, of course, energy producers, which are holding up better. Last point, just because there's an energy shock, obviously we worry a lot about inflation. What should we expect here? We have now inflation rising in our forecast to 3% in April, and then peaking at around 3.5% in May. Obviously, that depends on how the energy markets move, but at the current prices, we see the peak at around 3.5%. But then importantly, even though we have a peak in May, we think inflation will stay above 3% until the end of the year, so prolonged increase. And that is because the higher energy prices then feed through to food inflation, to goods inflation. So I think the message here is that for the remainder of this year, it's going to remain elevated inflation. The big question we ask ourselves is, what is the impact of second round effects? So is this now impacting wage rounds? Because if wages then increase, this could turn out into something a lot more prolonged and persistent as in 22, 23. We do not see that yet. So I don't know, none of the big wage negotiations ended in or started with big wage demands. So for now, that seems to be contained, but it's obviously something that the central banks are watching quite closely, in particular the ECB. What do we expect here? We think the ECB, which meets on Thursday, we don't think they will hike rates, but we do think in June and in September, they will increase rates by a combined 50 basis points. For a central bank, such a supply shock is difficult because it raises inflation, but it also dampens growth. So normally from a textbook perspective, you would look through this. But the rationale for an interest rate hike is that you want to send a signal and make sure that inflation expectations remain anchored, and that also then you don't get these second round effects in wages. Very last point, I was speaking about the ECB and rate hikes. We have lots of different reactions that we project across the globe. We think the Federal Reserve will rather cut rates, although only towards the end of the year. And we think the same will happen in the Bank of England. So very different responses to this oil shock. But for Europe, for Germany, for the ECB, we think 50 basis point rate hikes. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Felix. And in fact, that was now the final pessimistic element that was missing. So the energy crisis is already on its way to broaden and find its way to a economic crisis in many parts of the world. There's not much time left, but maybe one question to each of you, but to different people. If you would have a minute with the Minister of Finance, Felix, and the same would hold for Tatjana and Toril for the Minister of Energy Affairs, and Andreas for the Foreign Affairs. What is the guidance or the recommendation you would give them if they would be your German counterpart and you're next to them for a 1-minute advice to get us somehow out of this crisis, or at least to help that it's not worsening that much, as we saw so much threats that you all depicted very well. Felix, you like to start?
Yes, so I would make 2 points. The first is there's nothing we can do against an energy shock. The only thing that we can do is to cushion the shocks. And the advice would be, to implement measures that are timely, temporary, and targeted. So that's the usual economist advice. So don't implement measures that worsen your budget situation over the very long term. Ideally targeted to those that have the most impact on growth, and limited, make it temporary. But the other advice I would give is I come back to the positive thing I said at the beginning. We have a big fiscal package. We have one of the biggest fiscal packages that Germany ever implemented on defense and infrastructure. It's in the constitution, it's in the budgets. So it's actually quite a lucky coincidence that we're heading into this shock with this package. So everything to get this on the road as quickly as we can, I think would help GDP growth more than temporary measures.
Thanks. Tatjana, if you meet Katharina Reiche for a minute.
I don't think that she will like my comment or suggestion. It would be don't over-regulate. Markets can do this job much better than regulators, especially when it comes to the severe shock. What regulators should do in this situation is try to remove as many barriers as possible. Barriers for renewables, barriers for the new projects, barriers for any expansions, interconnectors, whatever can be available. Right now, as I said, Europe will need each and every molecule. Don't make barriers for obtaining these molecules by the market participants. They will always find the way how to find them and how to bring them in. But just, yeah, I would be here standing in a very liberal market position.
Right, and that includes storage regulation, I guess, as well. Huh? Right. Toril. Same to you.
Thank you. I would very much agree, both with Felix and Tatiana. Any measures taken, be it by the finance ministry or the energy ministries, should be temporary and they should be targeted. And, we need to see, I see there's temptation across countries to limit the impact on consumers by making fuels more affordable. And this is obviously a very politically sensitive topic. But we see when you're in a situation like we are today, when you have a physical lack of supplies, this is not necessarily the best option. So we're looking at, of course, if you need to put price measures in to make fuel more affordable, they should be targeted and they should be, as we said, temporary. Otherwise, we're looking to see, we made a lot of advice or recommendations on how to reduce demand. If we stay in the situation like we are today, both on the oil side and the gas side, when we're going to have a loss of supplies, we are going to have to need to reduce demand. And this is not something that is popular to talk about. We don't like demand restraint, but there's a lot of things that governments can do, policymakers can do to have an orderly reduction in demand that is less painful than when it comes through physical shortages or just through prices. And of course, in Europe, you asked me about jet fuel, and I apologize for having completely skipped that questions. In Europe, I said we're a bit, not just on the gas side, but also on the oil side, we haven't really seen the impact of the supply losses yet. Fuels continue to revive in Europe and in a lot of advanced economies. We have buffers to deal with supply shocks, not just in terms of emergency government stocks, but industry stocks, and across, and it's in the emerging and developing countries when they don't have these buffers that we're really going to see it. So if we lower our prices to be able to support consumers in our countries, and we don't have the supplies, prices have to go so much higher, and it's going to impact those countries disproportionately. Otherwise, I think no matter how this crisis unfolds, of course, we don't know, it's going to have lasting impacts on energy, the energy mix, on energy developments. And I think there's an opportunity here also to look at a policy that can speed up the energy transitions, to put in, Tatiana was talking about permitting. Can we look at measures that reduce our reliance on not just fossil fuels, but different suppliers and so forth. So I think these would sort of be my key points to make.
Thank you very much. And to bring it all back to geopolitics, where we started today, Andreas, your recommendation to whether it is a German or European policymaker in this field, is there any recommendation we give? Europe is so small in this game.
Yeah, look, I guess I would just go back to Churchill and say, never let a good crisis go to waste. And my advice would be maybe not necessarily to the foreign minister, but I would probably just go over to the chancellery and try and talk to Merz and say, look, the world has just become a lot more insecure. So resilience is something you want to invest in, which means we need to, and that's Tora's point, we need to invest into putting structural breaks into the energy system and the industrial system when it comes to fossil fuel demand, speed up the transition, make sure mobility and transport consumes less of the fossil fuels that are imported than we do right now, and speed up alternatives to the feedstock that at the moment is based on molecules in energy intensive industries. These are wonderful investments. Germany is in spending mode. Let's do it the right way.
Well, resilience will be, I guess, the key word of the year for all of us, also for the activities of the Federation of German Industries, as well as of the World Energy Council's Germany chapter. Thank you very much to all of you. I think that was very insightful analysis in 1 hour, very dense, very compressed. But I think together you gave a very, very good picture of where we stand. And I think it made clear that the situation might be even worse than we read in newspapers. That's not funny to hear, but it's something I think we have to think over. So thank you very much, and maybe see you back in a couple of weeks if this crisis stays with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thanks.